No, che devono finire devono sedersi perché altrimenti blocca la telecamera. Buon pomeriggio a tutti, riprendiamo i nostri lavori. Siccome questa mattina abbiamo parlato molto in inglese, adesso per la varietà delle lingue, considerando che alcuno dei relatori parlerà anche in italiano, cerchiamo di fare un mix tra italiano e inglese. Prima di iniziare questa sessione abbiamo un intervento breve presentato dal dottor Daniel Guéry, incaricato per le missioni presso la Conferenza Episcopale francese, coordinatore della piattaforma delle ONG di ispirazione cattolica che sono accreditate presso il Consiglio d'Europa, e proprio su questo presenterà questa relazione, di cui avete trovato anche una sintesi entrando alla sala, ed è anche membro fondatore del Forum Mondiale delle ONG di ispirazione cattolica. Professor Guéry, à vous la parole.
Thank you very much. Eminence, Excellencies, sisters and brothers in Christ, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for giving the International Organization of Catholic Inspiration the opportunity to contribute to the debates of these 3 European Catholic Social Days. For several years now, the NGO of Catholic Inspiration, accredited to international institutions, have been grouped together in the form of a World Forum. This is for us essential to be able to exchange in a relevant way on the issues and challenges of the world. The last World meeting was held in Rome at the end of the year 2019. The working theme was toward a more inclusive society. We have a book. If you want, I can send a PDF in every language. Last year, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Forum NGOs asked themselves on their personal and collective behaviors, on new ways of looking at society in the world we have been given. On this occasion, they experienced vulnerability. They also became aware that there are certain opportunities for reflection and action in the service on the common good. 5 things. First, consider global governance for a new future. 2, to realize that economic recovery is not enough to protect humanity. Third, reviewing priorities and relaunching social dialogues. 4, building on the positive. And last, moving toward in renewed construction of our societies. The theme of these 3 European Catholic Social Days is situated in this perspective. It is therefore with pleasure that 12 NGOs bring their contribution through the texts that are being given to you, mainly the NGOs concerned by the 3 main themes of the family, the digital transition, and the ecological transition. As the NGOs accredited to the European international institutions, we are very attentive to the effort currently being made in the field of social law through the European Union's European Social Rights Base or the Council of Europe's European Social Chart. Let us always remember that social justice is based on equality of these rights for all. Thus, in the text at your disposal, you can find some of our conviction for a new start in Europe beyond the pandemic. The central role of the family, the importance of intergenerational relations, the need for a renewed questioning on migration and the reception of refugees. The fight against the digital divide, which affects the poor first. The revision of working conditions with digital tools, teleworking, for example. The reinforcement of education in ethics, communication, and information in a digital age. The total involvement of all in the ecological transition from each individual to the states themselves. The pandemic has shown our interdependence in the field of health. The same is true for ecology. Our interdependence obliges us to share our resources and our projects. The challenge is to make our relationship with nature and with other human beings more appropriate. In the current events, let us read the sign of the time. Signs that will show us now to make a new start. Signs that will show us how to offer our Christian contribution to solidarity and justice in Europe and in the world. Before I finish, I think of all the people affected by the conflict in Ukraine. Think of all NGOs, the Christian NGOs, the churches that are active there. Some of them took part in writing the text that is in your hands. Their presence there and in all European countries is also a way of contributing to solidarity, justice, and peace. I thank you for your attention and apologize for my difficult English expression.
Tante grazie, professor Guéry, per questa presentazione di un ambito di lavoro spesso poco conosciuto, che è quello delle ONG di ispirazione cattolica presso organismi internazionali, in questo caso particolarmente il Consiglio d'Europa, con tutto quello che significa il lavoro del Consiglio d'Europa, tra cui in questi ultimi giorni la particolarità della sospensione prima, poi del ritiro di Russia, cosa che sarà, penso, da lei molto curato, monitorato da vicino, per il fatto che 1/3 delle cause presentate al Consiglio negli ultimi anni provengono proprio dalla Russia. Questo significa anche una mancanza di tutela per i cittadini russi a futuro, per cui credo che il suo lavoro è di grande valore e chi avesse qualche domanda da fare o interessi di approfondimento credo che si può rivolgere al professor Guéry durante le nostre pause. Cominciamo adesso quindi l'argomento specifico di questa seduta pomeridiana, che è incentrata sull'argomento della transizione ecologica. Noi sappiamo che questo termine di transizione ecologica è stato coniato nel 2005 da un ricercatore britannico, Rob Hopkins, che incominciò a dar forma a questo concetto intendendolo, come lo intendiamo noi oggi, come una ricerca perlomeno di un nuovo modello di vita economica, sociale, che risponda alle sfide che vengono presentate oggi dal punto di vista ecologico, del modo di vivere, del modo di lavorare, del modo di organizzare le nostre comunità. Quindi si tratta di rivedere tutti questi ambiti della nostra vita sociale e lavorativa proprio per cercare di ridurre l'impatto ambientale. Questo significa modificare abiti di consumo per ciascuno di noi, per le nostre attività comunitarie, significa limitare lo spreco, limitare anche tutto quello che poi viene scartato, e questo ci porta, come abbiamo sentito già tra ieri e questa mattina, a considerare la particolarità di alcuni ambiti della vita sociale. Noi adesso ci concentreremo specificamente in alcuni di questi settori che vengono più specificamente toccati da quello che significa la transizione ecologica. Incominceremo quindi con un primo intervento della professoressa Helga Kromkolb, che è già collegata con noi, credo che anche voi potete vederla, che è un'esperta in meteorologia ambientale, inquinamento atmosferico e cambiamento climatico. Ha una lunga carriera in questo ambito dal punto di vista universitario, ma anche e soprattutto scientifico. Lei è stata nell'ambito della meteorologia per molti anni professoressa, nominata scienziato dell'anno in Austria nel 2005, capo dell'Istituto di Meteorologia del Centro per il Cambiamento Globale e la Sostenibilità presso l'Università di Risorse Naturali, Scienze della Vita di Vienna, e ha partecipato anche a diverse istanze di dibattito e di intervento in questo ambito a livello internazionale, per cui credo che la sua parola e il suo contributo sarà un quadro di riferimento molto solido per questa parte del dibattito pomeridiano. Professor Helga Kromkolb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the kind introduction. Am I well heard? Can you hear me well? Okay. I will share my screen. I have named my intervention "Science will not solve the problem." There are many other groups, many other fields that will not solve the problem. We will need to solve them together. But what I would like to show you today is that churches, religions can contribute very, very significantly, especially at this specific junction of the problem. We are all aware of the multiple crises that are facing us, that are of different dimensions, of different timescales, but are critical. And they are all man-made. They are all self-made, including COVID, whether you consider it as the consequence of a laboratory experiment or a natural a consequence of the biodiversity pressure, the pressure we have been putting on biodiversity and on animals and plants. In both cases, it is man-made. So citing Laudato Si, an outsider looking at our world would be amazed at such behavior, which at times appears to be self-destructive. And I will continue to interject parts of Laudato Si because I think it's a very inspirational encyclica, and I think it is one of the pieces of paper and of thought that are more outspoken than many others we know. Now, if we look at the Global Risk Report that is published regularly during the Davos days, we can see that there's a multitude of different risks that we are facing. But at the very top, regarding impact and likelihood, we find failure for climate action, biodiversity loss, infectious diseases. And in regarding impact, and the only thing that is comparable is weapons of mass destruction. And then there's a a multitude of other risks: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, technological. And what is sort of lost in many of these analyses is that these risks are all interconnected. And it is 50 years ago that the Club of Rome published the report Limits to Growth. And in it is a very important statement that is valid today as it was then. In a limited system, and our global ecosystem is a limited system, exponential growth leads to overshoot and then to the collapse of the system. And again, citing Laudato Si, the pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes. And the question that is a very urgent question needing an urgent answer is how much time have we got left to avoid catastrophe? And I would like to show you just a few snapshots of where we stand. This is a graph showing the ecological aspects of our interventions into the global ecosystem. And you can see two circles here. The inner bluer circle encloses that area and that amount of intervention into the global ecological system that the system can well maintain, that it can recover from, that it is resilient against. And the red circle delimits the area from the outside where the uncertainty is extremely high and risk is extremely high. And the area in between blue and red is sort of the area of uncertainty where we cannot really tell yet how dangerous is it, how risky is it, where are we? And partly it is also a buffer zone because systems tend to develop on their own independent of our interaction. And what you can see is that there are several areas where we are beyond the red circle, areas where we are in high risk fields, and other areas where we are moving very close to the buffer zone, at least, or the zone of uncertainty. And amongst those are climate change, our land system change, and also very close to this field is also ocean acidification. So we are really in a dangerous area, moving in a dangerous area regarding the ecological system. Now, if we look at the social system, and here I only have two pictures, and if you would take those home with you, it might help you to keep a memory of what the social problems really are, or some of the social problems. And this is a picture of a family in Chad that has laid out before them what they eat in 1 week. And you can see there's some grains, there's some fruit, a little bit of vegetables, and a lot of water. And if you compare that to a similar picture for a German family, this is what it looks like. And since human beings are the same in Chad and in Germany, there's absolutely no good reasons why these pictures should be so different. And it is quite obvious that if we want the family in Chad to have a little bit more variety, maybe a little bit more of everything, then we will need to reduce our consumption. And so the question arises, we have the ecological problem and we have the social problem. And the question arises, what do we do first? Do we fight hunger first and then climate change, or the other way around? And what we have been doing over the last 30 or more years is that we have been trying to help countries with a low ecological footprint, but also a low human development index, to move forward into a better social dimension. And what we have done is always at the same time raised the ecological footprint. Now, in order to be sustainable, we need to be both within the ecological footprint and have sufficient social background to have a good life for everyone. And that would be the yellow part in this graph. And you can see there's not a single nation in that part. But you can also see that we need different paths. The path for the industrialized nations would be to come down with the ecological footprint. And the path for the developing nations is to raise the well-being of their people without raising the ecological footprint. So there's different paths for different countries that need to be followed, but they need to be followed at the same time, because this is essentially what the Sustainable Development Goals mean. They are 17 goals. Nevertheless, essentially, it's two agendas. It's the human security agenda and the planetary boundary agenda. And the challenge is to connect these synergistically and to avoid competition between them. That is the challenge we are facing now. And the nice thing about it is that if you face them together, you have a larger field of opportunities, more options of what you can do to solve the problems. So it makes solving easier if you look at the different challenges at the same time. Kate Allworth has drawn a picture of what she calls the donut economy that I think represents the situation very well. She has taken the ecological boundaries from that dark graph I showed you before, and she has added an inner circle with those social amenities, those social rights that we would like every person in the world to have. And she says that what is left between the ecological boundaries and the social boundaries, that is the operating space for economy. And from a just purely optical point of view, it is quite obvious that an economic system that is based on growth cannot be sustainable, because it will expand either into the ecological boundaries or it will push back the social boundaries. Now, I would just like to take a short deviation into the climate issue, because it is my field and because it is one of the most urgent problems we are facing. You are all aware of this kind of graph with temperature change, temperature rise taking place systematically with strong variations. I can show this also to you in an animation, if it works. Yeah, it's coming. You can see here on this map areas that are blue are colder than the long-term average, and whether it's yellow, it's warmer, or red, much warmer than the long-term average. And you can see that this is a very unquiet picture. There's a lot of variability. And now, beginning here in about the 1970s, we can see a systematic change towards global warming. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. And I would like to show you two scenarios where we could be heading. The pessimistic scenario is what I start out with. And again, quoting Laudato Si, the alliance between the economy and technology and sidelining everything unrelated to its immediate interest. So if we continue with that approach, this is where we're heading, possibly. There's no certainty in this because any future scenario has, of course, a lot of uncertainties. If you look at this graph of the last 600,000 years and just look at the bottom line, the temperature, then we can see that we have been switching between warm periods and ice ages. Temperature has gone up and down in cycles of about 100,000 years. And we can show this in a different type of graph. It looks something like this. Getting colder towards the left, warmer towards the right. We can see that there's two types of climate between which the Earth climate has been switching, cold and warm. And in order to make the switch, there was always some astronomically induced factor. We understand them. That is well understood and well documented. What we're doing now is we're accumulating greenhouse gases over the last 100 years, and this leads to a warming of the Earth temperature. and therefore a move towards the right, move towards a climate that is not so well understood, and we have questions to ask. We don't really know whether there is some other sort of stable situation at +2, 3, 4, 5 degrees, or whether we would be moving towards hothouse Earth, which means a continuous warming without hope of stabilizing the climate. And the second question we cannot answer is, how far are we along this way? So what scientists say, we don't really know what is ahead of us, but considering hothouse Earth, anything moving too far towards the warm side is too risky to bet against. So what we're really asked now to decide in this decade is whether we want to stabilize the climate. Then we should not accept any warming that is beyond 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or we should decide not to stabilize, which is an ethical problem, because it would mean continuous warming and hothouse Earth. The decision will be taken within this decade, because by the early 2030, 1.5 degrees will have probably been reached, which means that measures that need to be taken such that they are in effect this decade and not plans for the next or the decade after that. They need to take effect this decade, which means that we have to make do with technologies that are available now, with societal innovation that is available now, with things that we can handle now. And this urgency makes a special dimension, gives a special dimension to climate change. And it makes it different from most other problems that we know. Maybe biodiversity has a similar urgency, but biodiversity is much less well understood. So there is this urgency, and most people have not really become aware of this urgency. The optimistic scenario. So what can we expect if we take the right choice? Well, the optimistic scenario is a fragile stability path of the 1.5 degrees Celsius that was decided in the Paris Accord. Again, Laudato Si, the natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity, the responsibility of everyone, of every single person. And that is sort of the incentive, one of the main incentives why we really should be looking to achieve this optimistic scenario. Now, if we look at the climate in the optimistic scenario, we find that is not so very fortunate at all. I mean, we have summers like 2003, so extremely hot summers. There's some 700 million people under heat stress. We would have 3 to 4 month drought every year in Central Europe. So you can see it is not really the kind of climate we would be looking forward to. However, and that is something which is really important, the IPCC has just come up with a report which says we can adapt to 1.5 degrees because it won't be nice, but it will be stable and we can adapt to it. We can handle it. That is a temperature increase we could still handle. But there's an even more important aspect to it, and this is why I'm really showing you this. In order to achieve the necessary emission reductions, social and economic conditions will have to change dramatically, and they can change dramatically towards the better. And I think that is a very essential statement that in order to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius, we can make a shift towards a better world, towards a world with more justice, towards a world with more equity. What does it mean, achieving 1.5 degrees, staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, it means if you look at the budget, the CO2 budget that is still available, that while we have increased our emissions continuously over the past, we now have to dramatically decrease them and decrease them at a very, very fast pace. In order to stay within the budget, we have to have our emissions by 2030, and we have to come to net zero by 2050. This is on a global scale. which means that for industrialized nations, the ambition should be even higher. So you can see there's really a dramatic change necessary. And what does it imply? Of course, it implies replacing fossil energy by renewable energy. That is a technological problem, essentially, not only, but it is mainly a technological problem. But we also have to increase efficiency, similar service with less energy and less other resources. This is a technological problem, but it is also a lifestyle problem. And finally, we also have to focus on sufficiency, to make do with less. And that is a question of mindset and of lifestyle. And if we look at the incentives within our present economic systems, you can see that on the right-hand side, there are quite some incentives for changing from fossils to renewables. Incentives for efficiency are smaller, and there's very little incentive in the economic system to focus on sufficiency. So we really need a full transformation of our economy. This is something Angela Merkel said when the floods hit Germany last summer. And if you look at this list, energy, industry, mobility, infrastructure, all of these fields, we will have to have fundamental changes in the approach. And the nice thing is, as I said before, all of these changes can be towards the good, can be for a better life, for more equity, for more justice, and for more quality of life. Not more goods, but more quality of life. And again, if we look at Laudato Si, there is a request, a demand to change the ways of thinking, to look for integrated solutions. Ecological culture cannot be reduced to a series of urgent and partial responses to the immediate problems of pollution, environmental decay, and so on. There is a need for a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, of policies, educational programs, a lifestyle and a spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. So this is fully in line with what we understand from an economic point of view. And sort of a summing up of these last sentences is that to seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. I think that is something very essential. And this is something we should also keep in mind when we look at the different political programs, be they on the national level, be they at the EU level, or be they at the global level. Are they just masking the deepest problems on the global system? And these deepest problems have something to do with our overuse of our ecological system, and they have something to do with our indifference to social problems that are out there and that are growing with our system. And Greta Thunberg says that if solutions are so impossible to find within the system, then maybe we should change the system. And I think that is one very important aspect that we need to remember. And we can no longer focus on what is politically possible. Instead, we have to focus on what is necessary and make that possible. Otherwise, there is no hope. And one of the key issues that has to be addressed in this context is that we need a change of minds and of hearts. What I'm showing you here is a circumplex of values, in this case, according to Casa. And you can see that there's different values that are within each of us. Every one of us has all of these values, but we give them different priorities. And you can see some of these values are of an extrinsic nature, like popularity, image, financial success, and some of an intrinsic nature, such as affiliation, self-acceptance, community. And what our present economic system does is that it emphasizes these extrinsic values. Wherever you look, whatever you listen to, any advertisement, it's always about being nice, rich, powerful, and so on. And what we really need is to focus on intrinsic values and spirituality. And this shift from extrinsic values to intrinsic values, that can be achieved by addressing these topics. And the shift in values from hedonistic and intrinsic values towards intrinsic values is a shift away from our present economic thinking. Our economic and societal systems, they nurture these extrinsic hedonistic values. But self-transcendent and intrinsic values are embedded in every world religion. Therefore, it is important that the world religions take a lead and remind all of us that these values are really the values that give value to life, that make up happiness, and that make life successful. And by addressing these values, we can strengthen them. There's scientific evidence for this. If you address these values, then you strengthen them. By giving hope, you strengthen them. Because whenever people are afraid, they cling to extrinsic values. But when they are hopeful, when they are full of self-resources, then they have the power and the energy to live intrinsic values. And by living them, they strengthen themselves. So religions should not be afraid of addressing the values they stand for. Transformation will not happen without the shift of value. We can talk about economic systems, but in order to change economic systems, we can talk about financial systems, but in order to change financial systems, we first need a shift in values within the minds and the hearts of the people. And again, this is exactly what Laudato Si also asks of us. And I think that is the real message that we need to take along. This is every single person's responsibility, but it is a special responsibility of religious groups, because in groups we are much stronger than we are as individuals. Thank you very much for your attention. I cannot hear anything.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I hear you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation, so clear. And even though it is a dramatic picture, you have been able to present it in a very calm and convincing way. Thank you very much. I think you touched one of the most important questions you have to face, probably we will taken up during the debate, and is the increase of energy consumption, for instance, we have in our societies. It is amazing to see that in these last years, beginning with the lockdown and since the beginning of the pandemic, we have had in Europe a huge increase in energy consumption. So it is related to our style of life more than anything. That's why I think you were right to present the picture from a scientific perspective and touching what is related to us, and is the need to change our style of life, and that requires to change our hearts. Thank you very much. Can you stay with us for the whole session? Okay, thank you. So we can take up some questions afterwards. Adesso passerò la parola a Monsignor Bogdan Đurak, che per molti anni, essendo vescovo dal 2006, per molti anni è stato vescovo di Curia della Chiesa greco-cattolica ucraina, segretario del Sinodo dei Vescovi, e dall'anno scorso è esarca apostolico degli ucraini greco-cattolici per la Germania e Scandinavia. Noi a Monsignor Đurak avevamo chiesto inizialmente di presentare a grandi linee il progetto che la loro Chiesa aveva sviluppato negli ultimi anni riguardo al modo in cui una comunità ecclesiale può contenere l'impatto ambientale, cosa che loro hanno fatto molto bene, con progetti molto interessanti, ma certamente che con la situazione che viviamo in questi giorni credo che la sua attenzione sarà rivolta ad un'altra questione. E mi ha fatto venire in mente questo particolare qualcosa che Giovanni Paolo II ha detto visitando la cattedrale cattolica a Buenos Aires nel 1987, io ero presente lì, e lui, dopo aver ricordato i festeggiamenti di quel momento, del battesimo della Rus di Kiev e altre occasioni importanti per la vita della comunità ucraina, diceva, rivolgendosi particolarmente ai vescovi, ai fedeli sacerdoti latini, diceva: vorrei invitarvi ad abbracciare insieme con me tutta la comunità ucraina, perché essa senta che tutta la Chiesa cattolica partecipa alla sua gioia come alle sue sofferenze. Credo che queste parole di Giovanni Paolo II siano più che indicate per esprimere anche i nostri sentimenti nei confronti di tutto il popolo ucraino. Monsignor Giurak, a lei la parola.
Grazie mille, Monsignore, Eminenza, Eccellenze, cari partecipanti di questo evento tanto importante per tutta l'Europa, per la Chiesa Cattolica in Europa. Soprattutto vorrei salutarvi tutti qui radunati e anche collegati con noi tramite internet, a nome del padre e capo della nostra Chiesa, Sua Beatitudine Sviatoslav, con il quale ho potuto parlare stamattina, e vogliamo esprimere la nostra gratitudine a tutti voi, a tutta la Chiesa Cattolica in Europa, ma anche in tutto il mondo, per questa solidarietà impressionante che stiamo sperimentando in queste settimane. Ci avete sostenuto con generosità negli ultimi decenni della ripresa della vita ecclesiastica e sociale in Ucraina. Abbiamo costruito tante cose insieme, ma adesso assistiamo alla crudele devastazione di tutto ciò che è stato creato con tanta dedizione e tanta generosità. Infatti mi è chiesto di condividere con voi la nostra esperienza della promozione della conversione ecologica in Ucraina e il modo in quale la Chiesa greco-cattolica disegna progetti di risparmio energetico, di costruzione delle chiese in modo più ecologico, eccetera. E infatti, dopo aver istituito nel 2007 ufficio per salvaguardia del creato, abbiamo sviluppato tanti progetti su diversi livelli. Si potrebbe menzionare tanti, cominciando da centinaia di audit energetici delle istituzioni, delle comunità ecclesiastiche, tramite l'iniziativa di rinunciare ai fiori di plastica nei cimiteri, molto in uso fino a poco tempo fa, e diverse pubblicazioni sulla tematica ecologica, e fino agli sforzi educativi pertinenti nei seminari, nelle scuole di diversi livelli che tendono alla creazione di una cultura e mentalità ecologica nella Chiesa e nella società ucraina. Tutto questo e ancora molto di più si potrebbe condividere con voi oggi. Ora invece posso condividere con voi solo il dolore del mio popolo e della mia terra, afflitta dalla guerra orribile guidata dalla Federazione Russa già da 8 anni, che in queste ultime settimane è scoppiata con una crudeltà sconvolgente. Le immagini delle scuole e degli ospedali distrutti, dei quartieri interi trasformati in rovine, dei bambini e delle donne uccisi in questo massacro di massa sconvolgono le anime e disturbano le coscienze degli europei. Le barbarie di questo genere non possono accadere in Europa del XXI secolo. Eppure accadono davanti a tutto il mondo. Davanti a tutto il mondo un popolo europeo viene crocifisso, viene punito, per così dire, per la sua scelta di vivere nella dignità e nella giustizia. e per il suo desiderio di decidere liberamente e da solo sul suo futuro. Nella sola città martire di Mariupol, dell'Ucraina sudorientale sulla costa del Mar Azov, con 400.000 abitanti, sono stati uccisi nelle ultime 2 settimane più di 2.500 persone civili. In più, il mercoledì scorso, nella stessa città, hanno bombardato il teatro, sapendo che lì si nascondono le donne e i bambini. Ed erano 1.300. Fino ad oggi sappiamo dei 130 sopravvissuti, del resto della gente che rimane bloccata sotto non si sa nulla. Il vice sindaco di questa città, Mariupol, diceva in un'intervista qualche giorno fa: abbiamo qui 3.000 bambini, le loro madri li stanno allattando. Una madre non ha latte, chiede: dove posso trovare il porridge per bambini? E noi capiamo che non ce l'abbiamo. Un'altra mamma chiama, non grida, non litiga e in una voce quasi assente chiede: qui ho la mia bambina tra le braccia che sta morendo di fame. Cosa devo fare? E non hai risposta a questa domanda, confessa il vice sindaco Sergei Orlov. Ma questa inaccettabile aggressione armata, come la chiama Santo Padre Francesco, che riduce la città a cimiteri, non solo provoca un dolore immenso e la morte delle persone innocenti, ma porta con sé anche una devastazione e disastri ecologici di ogni genere. Io suppongo che gli organizzatori di queste giornate non hanno neanche pensato su questo aspetto ecologico che avviene adesso in Europa. Distruzione dell'ambiente naturale dalla guerra. Questo non abbiamo pensato ancora, forse un mese fa, che è una sfida enorme per il nostro continente dopo la seconda guerra mondiale. Eppure immagini che provengono da Ucraina mostrano ciò che è successo 80 anni fa. Le stesse immagini. Ma già nei primi anni dopo l'invasione russa nel 2014 l'ONU ha definito la zona di guerra in Ucraina orientale il territorio più minato al mondo. E il Donbass, con le sue centinaia di miniere attive e inattive, appariva già in quel tempo come una catastrofe ecologica in slow motion. Il pericolo si è aggravato adesso ancora di più, drammaticamente, quando sono state colpite le stazioni nucleari che producono elettricità, quelle di Chernobyl e Zaporizhzhia. Vi potete immaginare le conseguenze di una esplosione a Zaporizhzhia, dove si potrebbe temere un'esplosione 10 volte più grande di quella di Chernobyl. È un vero e proprio ricatto nucleare con il quale viene minacciato tutto il continente europeo. A fronte di una tale realtà si avverte la verità delle parole di San Giovanni Paolo II, che in una delle sue preghiere per la pace definiva la guerra quale, e cito qui, minaccia per tutte le creature, in cielo, in terra ed in mare. Si può evitare questa minaccia o fermarla solo tramite una conversione. Qui do ragione anche alla professoressa Kromkolb che parlava del cambiamento della mente e del cuore. Proprio noi siamo abituati a parlare della conversione ecologica, ma io direi adesso si deve dire proprio semplicemente di una conversione vera e propria, una conversione di cuore profonda e autentica accompagnata allo stesso tempo dalla grazia divina e dallo sforzo umano. La grazia divina la attingiamo dalla preghiera perseverante e piena di fiducia in Dio, che è vicino a chi ha il cuore ferito. Egli salva gli spiriti affranti, come dice il Salmo 34. Ma lo sforzo umano, considerai in 3 dimensioni, intrinsecamente legati tra di loro, come il servizio triplice della comunità ecclesiale in questo tempo. Prima di tutto, il servizio coraggioso alla verità. Dico coraggioso perché non di raro si avvertiva un certo equivoco o una certa paura nel chiamare per nome le cose e le cause di tutto ciò che accadeva in Ucraina. Si parlava della crisi ucraina, della violenza nell'est del paese, dei separatisti di Donbass, eccetera. Solo pochi, anche nell'ambito ecclesiastico, sin dall'inizio parlavano chiaramente e in modo aperto della guerra, dell'aggressione esterna russa contro uno Stato europeo. Ma se non si identifichi la causa della crisi e se le cose non vengono chiamate per nome, non si lascia spazio alla verità, che unica ci può fare liberi. Verità unita con amore sanisce, salva. Ma dove manca la verità, allora viene la menzogna, i compromessi. E questa menzogna è l'arma bellica dell'aggressore. Diceva San Giovanni Paolo II nel suo messaggio per il 50° anniversario della fine in Europa della Seconda Guerra Mondiale. E qui cito le sue parole. Durante la Seconda Guerra Mondiale, oltre alle armi convenzionali e a quelle chimiche, biologiche e nucleari, si è fatto ampiamente ricorso ad un altro micidiale strumento bellico, la propaganda. Prima di colpire l'avversario con i mezzi della distruzione fisica, si è cercato di annientarlo moralmente con la denigrazione, le false accuse, l'orientamento dell'opinione pubblica verso la più irrazionale intolleranza, mediante ogni forma di indottrinamento, specialmente nei confronti dei giovani. La guerra odierna è stata per lunghi anni ben preparata e anche oggi viene ogni giorno sostenuta ed accompagnata da una colossale macchina propagandista tipica di ogni regime totalitario armare. Allora la Chiesa dovrebbe dire no alla paura paralizzante e sì alla paresia evangelica, l'espressione nobile e coraggiosa del servizio profetico della Chiesa. Poi il secondo elemento o servizio, coltivazione della memoria viva. Viva perché non rivolta solo verso il passato, custodendo il ricordo degli eventi tragici, i nomi degli assassini e delle vittime innocenti, ma perché ci fa capire degli eventi attuali e ci aiuta a costruire il futuro dignitoso, evitando gli errori storici del passato. Qui si tocca, secondo me, un punto nevralgico, non ancora elaborato a sufficienza né dagli scientifici, né dai politici, né tantomeno dalla Chiesa. L'Europa si è potuta liberare dal peso dell'ideologia nazista tramite un esame di coscienza sincero e tramite la condanna ufficiale del nazismo. Lo stesso non è stato fatto sull'eredità sanguinosa del regime comunista. Al contrario, si erano avvertite le tendenze del negazionismo mascherato o palese, che tendeva a minimizzare, se non addirittura negare, le efferate azioni del comunismo sul nostro continente. In questo modo si è addomesticato e diffuso nelle nostre società uno spirito dell'amnesia sul comunismo, come direbbe Stéphane Courtois. un autore francese storico. Così che si potrebbe dare a lui la ragione, e lui ha scritto anche il famoso libro nero del comunismo, il quale sosteneva che, e qui la cito, la società europea non ritroverà né la sua identità né il suo equilibrio, noi direbbe oggi né la sua pace, se cercherà di occultare la memoria della tragedia comunista. Fino alla citazione. Aggiungerei, per trarne gli insegnamenti sinceri e durevoli. Forse proprio per questo il regime di Cremlino si oppone disperatamente contro quell'esame di coscienza, chiamandolo inaccettabile revisionismo storico. Ma sono convinto che una revisione del passato sia necessaria se si vuole giungere alla libertà dello spirito e alla salute integra dei cittadini europei. Altrimenti la malattia non identificata e non guarita prima o poi tornerà con gli effetti ancora più devastanti. Infatti, adesso assistiamo ad una recidiva del passato ateo e disumano, perché colpire la gente civile è un atto dell'ateismo, non dell'eroismo. E non si può giustificare la guerra in nessun modo. E si usa adesso come bandiera la dottrina del cosiddetto Ruskij Mir, il mondo russo, che ha portato nella mia terra tanta sofferenza e un dolore immenso. I sintomi di questa malattia dello spirito e delle coscienze contaminate dalla propaganda dell'odio sono sconvolgenti. Basta pensare che, secondo le indagini pubblicate qualche giorno fa, 86,6% cittadini russi sopportano l'attacco militare russo sul territorio dell'Ucraina. Ripeto, 86,6%. Gli altri, più di 75, approvano l'idea dell'attacco militare contro un altro paese europeo, nominando in prima linea Polonia, poi vengono menzionati con diverse percentuali Bulgaria, Repubblica Ceca, Slovacchia, Ungheria e così via, per giungere alla fine a quel 75% che ammettono l'uso delle armi nucleari contro gli altri popoli e paesi. È una scelta bellica sotto la quale non si riconosce più quella nazione che si vanta del grande Fyodor Dostoevskij e allo stesso tempo dimentica la sua affermazione che, una citazione famosa, la salvezza di tutto il mondo non vale una sola lacrima di un bambino torturato. Oggi nella mia patria in Ucraina scorrono fiumi di sangue e di lacrime, parole di Santo Padre Francesco. Le lacrime delle donne e degli uomini, dei bambini e delle persone anziane. Quanti ancora ce ne vorranno per giungere al pentimento e alla conversione sanatrice? Dunque, superiamo l'amnesia storica tramite lo sforzo consapevole per ottenere la grazia della catarsi, e cioè della conversione del cuore e purificazione della mente, che ci aiuterà a ritrovare la vera dignità e libertà dei figli di Dio. E l'ultimo, mantenere la memoria viva vuol dire anche non dimenticare la sofferenza di altrui, ma essere capaci a una solidarietà durevole e non transitoria e momentanea, perché la carità, se è vera, non volta troppo velocemente le spalle da chi sta soffrendo, ma è pronta ad accompagnare la vittima per curare le ferite e aiutarla a riprendere la vita, come lo fece il buon samaritano. E qui volevo dire, su questa terza dimensione, dove la Chiesa in Europa è chiamata a svolgere un ruolo catalizzante e protagonista, e cioè la solidarietà durevole e operosa, su tutti i livelli, spirituale, sociale, culturale, politico, semplicemente umano. Nei giorni come quelli del tempo odierno, le attitudini si radicalizzano, si manifesta la brutalità dell'odio e d'altra parte la bellezza dell'amore compassionevole. Tutti capiamo che è giunta l'ora delle azioni, non delle parole. Oppure la parola del Vangelo adesso si sta incarnando nelle opere della carità e della solidarietà e della vicinanza di tanti europei, i nostri fratelli e sorelle. Questo ci commuove nel profondo del cuore e vorrei approfittare di questa occasione per dire a voi tutti che ci sostenete, che pregate per noi e ci aiutate ad attraversare quella prova storica il nostro cordiale grazie. Specialmente la Chiesa Cattolica in Europa, nella sua solidarietà con le vittime della guerra in Ucraina, sta mostrando il suo volto materno lucente, che non solo viene talvolta oscurato dagli scandali e dalle ferite, ma è adesso illuminato dalla luce dell'amore, anzi dalla luce del risorto stesso, e la riflette. Questa luce però risplende anche nelle azioni delle società europee cosiddette secolari, testimoniando che nonostante delle statistiche quantitative, la civiltà europea mantiene la sua anima cristiana che la ispira e la orienta nelle scelte essenziali e definitive. E questo rafforza la speranza in noi tutti. Oserei addirittura a dire che in mezzo alla grande sofferenza del popolo ucraino sta nascendo una nuova Europa, un'Europa dei valori e non degli interessi, un'Europa per la quale i concetti come giustizia, dignità, libertà e fraternità non sono parole vuote, ma costituiscono i principi fondamentali sui quali solo si può costruire un futuro sicuro e degno dell'uomo e dell'umanità di domani. Una terra rinnovata, di cui ha scritto il nostro più grande poeta nazionale Taras Shevchenko. E sulla terra rinnovata non ci sarà nemico avversario, e ci sarà il figlio, e ci sarà la madre, e ci saranno le persone sulla terra. І на оновленій землі врага не буде супостата, а буде син, і буде мати, і будуть люди на землі. Adesso vi chiederei e inviterei semplicemente a mettersi davanti al Signore per chiedere nel proprio cuore il perdono e la grazia della conversione per noi stessi e per gli oppressori e rivolgere verso il Padre Celeste questa preghiera di San Giovanni Paolo II. Padre che ami la vita, Padre che ami la vita, nella risurrezione del tuo Figlio Gesù hai rinnovato l'uomo e l'intera creazione e hai voluto arrecare loro come primo dono la tua pace. Guarda con compassione l'umanità lacerata dalla guerra. Conserva le creature del cielo, della terra e del mare, opera delle tue mani, minacciate da distruzioni tra inaudite sofferenze, e fa che per intercessione di Santa Maria solo la pace guidi le sorti dei popoli e delle nazioni. Padre, concedi al nostro mondo i giorni della tua pace. Grazie.
Eccellenza, grazie per la sua testimonianza. Credo che non sia facile affrontare questo argomento in un contesto come questo, però ho l'impressione che, come in tanti momenti della storia dei popoli slavi, particolarmente del popolo ucraino, in questi momenti di tragedia molti guardano i pastori come guida, come orientamento, e noi cerchiamo di stare vicini proprio per questo, perché voi possiate guidare il popolo ucraino per uscire da questa tragedia umana. Now we go back to the subject of ecological transition, and we will hear Ms. Marie Laval, after several commitments in diocesan levels and working with youth associations. In 2019, she was elected International President of the International Federation of Catholic Parochial Youth Movements. And since 2021, last year, she works as an executive officer at the CIVIS, how do you say, CIVIS? Media Foundation for Integration and Cultural Diversity. Mrs. Laval, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, dear guests, dear speakers, dear delegates also in the Zoom conference, I'm very happy to be here today in the third edition of these European Catholic Social Days, and I would like to warmly thank Comisse for the invitation. I'm going to briefly present to you my organization before we come to the topic and the subject of the ecological transition in our work. FIMCAP is the International Federation of Catholic Parochial Youth Movements. We have 31 organizations, member organizations all over the world, and except for our General Secretary, all the work in FIMCAP is led and implemented by volunteers, young people from all over the world. FIMCAP advocates on a political and also on a church level for different topics that have a current and an urgent reference and that are discussed among the Catholic groups on the grassroots level. All these topics you can see on this slide are based on our common values as Christians and also on the current reality of life in the parochial youth groups. When we focus on the topic of climate crisis, we observe that specifically young people, while they are the ones who will have to live with today's decision the longest, who feel a big anxiety over the prospect of the huge detriments and dangers imposed by the climate crisis, feel often frustrated and also powerless, not knowing how they can participate in accelerating and shaping the transitional process that will have a fundamental impact on their future lives. As UNEP stated in its report on climate change and human rights in 2015, climate change is one of the greatest threats to human rights of our generation, posing a serious risk to the fundamental rights to life, health, food, and adequate standard of living of individuals and communities across the world. If we fail to take the necessary measures to combat the climate crisis, those that will suffer from the implications of the resulting climate breakdown are going to be individuals and social groups that are already vulnerable, and specifically and in particular disadvantaged young people. At the same time, the transition to make our society and economy sustainable requires massive investments, both in sufficient action to tackle the climate crisis and unjust distribution of the costs of the indispensable transformation to a sustainable society and economy carry an enormous risk of dividing our society and dividing the countries of Europe. So, as we already heard in my predecessor's speeches, the ecological transition is also always a social transition. So, fighting the climate crisis effectively and ensuring a truly just transition is nothing less than a fight for human rights, for human dignity, equality, democracy, and the unity of Europe. For this reason, FIMCAP has been advocating with its member organizations, its working groups and partners for years now toward the European Union and its institutions and member states to accelerate and increase their measures to counter the climate crisis and its consequences. We want to make sure that young people's ideas and visions to make a just transition possible are implemented in the practice, in the political practice. FIMCAP is active in various bodies and is also doing a lot of representations. We are represented in the European Youth Forum, and we also send delegations to the past different COPs in the last years. We are also a very active member in the organization Generation Climate Europe, that unites some of the biggest youth organizations in Europe in order to advocate together toward the European institutions for more climate action. The main objective of GCE is to achieve a comprehensible, a rapid, and a just transition that will make our economy and society sustainable. Among our own bodies, there is, for example, the FIMCAP Europe Policy Pool and the Pool of Trainers, who both organize various projects on climate action and who advocate on a political and church level, but also implement the topic in our own structures and formation for young people and children. FIMCAP constantly tries to identify social vulnerabilities and challenges young people are confronted with and make sure that these needs and vulnerabilities are taken into account when planning the transition of our society and economy. We also want to identify barriers that exist and obstacles that make it difficult for young people to live a sustainable life. And we want to empower these young people from all backgrounds to participate in the crucial ongoing decision-making process that will determine the future of us all, ensuring their voices are heard. We want to make sure that the ecological transition takes into account the needs of the young generation and that its costs are distributed in a just way, imposing the costs on those who can afford the most while allowing everybody to enjoy the profits. An approach not only inspired by the values of Christian social teaching, but also by the universal, indivisible human rights. How we take action against these climate crises. Today, I have brought to you 3 examples that exemplify a bit FIMCAP's commitment to fighting the climate crisis. First of all, you can see the European Youth and Climate Justice Report that is called Young Voices on Climate Justice. Together with the GCE, FIMCAP Europe collected the opinions and ideas of young Europeans on climate justice in 2022. This report contains the voices of 361 young people from 37 different European countries. They took part in the qualitative survey conducted for the study. The results of the study include not only challenges, but numerous ideas, quotes of the young people, and proposals for solutions from these young Europeans that are based on their current reality of life. FIMCAP Europe was also part of the Interfaith Youth Convention on the European Green Deal last autumn that also happened together with Comesse. And in 2019, prior to the European elections, FIMCAP Europe organized a campaign under the hashtag Vote Youthfully. The aim of the campaign was to motivate young people to vote in the European elections, but also to inform them about the programmatic voting options that they had. For the campaign, FIMCAP asked all the party groups represented in the European Parliament about their positions and topics on particularly relevant things for young people, including the questions about climate justice and sustainability. And during the weeks before the elections, all the answers of the different parties were published on a blog so that young people could see whether their needs are met or not in the different programs. I have put a bit of the different categories of the needs and wishes that young Europeans indicated in the report that I just mentioned on this slide. And as you can see on the upper part of the slide, it is referring to a most European level, while the part on the bottom of the slide also include the very important global context. The report is a very detailed elaboration of the wishes and needs of European youth and proposes differentiated approaches to solutions in the different fields that you can see on the slide. So what is our vision on the future in FIMCAP? In FIMCAP and in our member organizations, we train children and youth ourselves in our formations to become leaders. A big part of these formations is to share ideas about sustainable living and to encourage our members to get active for climate. But the most important point, in our opinion, is to anchor the topic structurally at all political and all church levels. As the example of the ecological footprint has shown, it will take much more effort, much more greater effort than individual frugality to tackle the omnipresent climate crisis. Especially from a social perspective, the sustainable perspectives needs to be more promoted. We want to significantly strengthen the dialogue between faith-based youth and European stakeholders to inspire each other and to make change happen. As Christians, we want to tackle this task together as a community that seeks to preserve creation for the benefit of children, youth, and future generations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this presentation that shows the commitment of youth people in this subject of ecological transition, not only regarding the work within the church, but as you showed, even in the civil arena. This shows the need for citizen participation in this subject, which is clearly shown in your commitment. And it reminds me of a definition that was presented by the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development in 1997, saying that sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So nobody is better than a youth person to defend this value and to work for it. Thank you very much. And now I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is connected with us through the technological means, is the MAP Philippe Lambert. He is from Belgium. He studied engineering in applied mathematics at the Catholic University of Louvain. Then he worked in commercial and managerial positions, and then he was elected an MAP, and now he aims to keep climate emergency at the top of the European agenda will continue the fight for social, economic, and environmental justice. So we are very glad to hear your voice and your presentation. Mr. Lambert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monsignor, and well, thank you for the invitation, and I really regret not being there in person. I try to reduce my ecological footprint as well, so I try to limit my travels, but of course at the expense of real human contact, because indeed Zoom is a nice tool, but it's no substitute for real contact. I hope that there will be other opportunities to meet. I listened carefully to the previous speakers, and of course one cannot help but be moved, well, more than moved, by what is happening in Ukraine and the predicament outlined by Monsignor Jura is really heartbreaking, and indeed I think it keeps our minds focused, with the risk, of course, that this distracts from the goal of fighting climate change. But back to what Professor Kolb said, I think she summarized the predicament we're in very nicely in a way. And the key element of our presentation is that we have known this for 50 years. We have known that there would be planetary boundaries met without a change, of course, 50 years ago. That's the Club of Rome report. And it was not just climate, it was pollution, resource exhaustion, and all the rest of it. And the question that everyone has to ask oneself is, how come that, having known everything for the last 50 years, the course of humanity has not been changed? And that is, of course, a key question. So again, it is not a matter of not knowing. So if it's not about lack of knowledge, it must be about something else. And that something else, I think, has been laid out very brightly by Laudato Si. It is a choice for what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, what I call the neoliberal ideology. That is an ideology that considers nature, life, human life, as just tradable goods, and that reduces the human being to an individual just in pursuit of maximizing personal wealth, personal advantage. And this technocratic paradigm is killing, not just figuratively, it is killing materially. And that is also very clearly said by Laudato Si. So the fact is that actually, if change has not been made, of course, it's partly because everyone, including me, does not like necessarily change. So there's a natural resistance to change, but also because there are interests at stake, massive interests. I mean, look at what happened the last 10, 12 years. We have had the global financial crisis, followed in Europe by the Eurozone crisis, followed by the pandemic, and now we have war in Ukraine. And you can see that parts, small parts, but parts of our societies, through all these episodes, are just growing wealthier. I mean, the consumption for luxury goods, including massive yachts and aircraft and jewelry and all the rest of it, has been increasing, not decreasing. So indeed, if this system carries on, well, there must be people taking advantage of it, otherwise it won't happen. So that is really the situation in which we are. So we know that we are facing planetary boundaries. We know that we are already shifting. And I think the animated map that Professor Kolb showed is very explicit on that. So the change has been accelerating, so we can feel it, but the resistance to change is enormous. So are we going to tackle the change and to basically use the 8 years that separate us from 2030, which is a window of, I wouldn't say opportunity, the window of possibility of change, to just make sure that we are going to stay, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? I would say that I don't know. And this is a real answer. It's a real answer. It could be that we are going to do it, but it could also be that we are not going to do it. Today, in a way, I'm a bit more optimistic than I was. Of course, let me first focus on Europe. For decades, Europe has done as if this challenge did not exist. I remember when Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the Commission, left us at the end of his 5-year term. In his farewell speech, he spoke for 25 minutes about his 5 years leading the Commission, and the word climate was not even mentioned, even though the COP21 in Paris happened during his term. Now we have Ursula von der Leyen leading the European Commission, and believe me, I work with her quite closely, and she's totally committed to a change of course. Now, there's ambiguity there because indeed, for her, tackling climate change is also our new growth strategy, whereas as Professor Combe said, well, you know, you can't have infinite growth in a materially finite world. This is just not possible. This is physically impossible. So there's an ambiguity there. But of course, there's a lot of resistance. I would say that the first test was passed successfully because when we got the pandemic and Europe decided to have a common recovery plan, instead of shelving the European Green Deal, actually this European Green Deal was put at the core of the recovery plan. So indeed, there was a lot of pressure from those who benefit from inaction to forget about the European Green Deal, and that was not the case. So that is rather good news. But we have disturbing signals at the moment that indeed, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the Russian invasion, the rising costs of fossil fuels, the rising cost of food, there's again a lot of pressure to postpone the necessary changes. Because, for instance, I just mentioned food. That means agriculture. Agriculture is a massive CO2 emitter, while agriculture could be a massive CO2 capture instrument. But for that, you need to change your agricultural system. Well, at the moment, this is not on the agenda. So I would say that if I look at European pictures, there's reasons to hope, there's reasons to be worried. What worries me more is the rest of the world. Because if you look at the other big emitters, in the US, it increasingly appears visible that Joe Biden has no majority in Congress to pass aggressive climate legislation. And in China, well, you know, they just want to keep political peace. And for that, well, they need to have a massive growth in order to make sure that they won't have revolt. So I'm not sure how far they will want to go. So this is a worrying situation, yet, and I will finish here. You know, I often meet young people, and I was again last week in Terza, where we discussed these issues. I sense the deep worry, and you know, my children are aged between 26 and 33, so they are really at the forefront of what is happening. They are worried. But there's every reason to believe that we are doomed. But that again is the message of Laudato Si is, okay, if we let ourselves be overwhelmed by anxiety and despair, then I would say the fateful end becomes a certainty. That means that if we don't act, if we let ourselves to be overwhelmed, then we are certain to meet climate doom. On the other hand, if we choose for hope, and that is what I'm doing with many others, if we choose for hope, we have no certainty of success, but at least we make everything possible to grab every chance that is possible to give a future to this humanity. And I agree very much with Marie. This is a matter of human rights. This is a matter of human dignity. And again, this is pretty well explained in Laudato Si. The climate change is not just a technical issue. Actually, it's a matter of choosing a world where every human being has the right to live a fulfilling life. And that is it. That is the key question for this century. And it's a make or break moment for humanity. But as I often say, not every generation has the chance to live the beginnings of a change of civilization for a better. And that's basically where we are today. So let's go for it. Not sure I hear anything.
Can you hear me?
No, yes.
Okay, while the technicians try to recuperate. Okay, now you can hear. Thank you for your presentation, for this political and legislative outlook at the European level, and mainly for this positive vision. I think one of the key features of the current trend of ecological transition is this optimistic vision of the future. And I think we need to work and to build on that. Thank you very much. Now we have the proposal to prolong for 10 more minutes this session so we can have some 20 minutes of discussion. In the meantime, if the people of Zoom wants to present some questions, you can use your chat box just to let us know what you would like to ask. We have a first question at the back.
I'm Sarah from the International Young Christian Workers. And thanks so much for these inspiring and wonderful presentations, really describing the reality, but also giving hope. And I have a question because from an international point of view, as an international movement, we experience the rise of calamities, which are happening in more and more countries and more often. And more people are losing their homes, also because of the climate crisis. And there is this concept of a path for people who lost their homes because of the climate crisis, for them to be able to settle wherever they want, all over the world. Now, that is a dream, and obviously in this current system it doesn't work. But how would you think, as speakers, would this something that we should all go as Catholic Church for, to really make sure that people who lost their home because of this collective responsibility that, we caused this collateral damage, that actually they should have the right to settle wherever they want?
For whom is this question? All the panel. Okay. We can collect one more question. Someone else? Yes, here, second row.
Thank you. My name is Ulrich Hemmel, and I found the presentations excellent. My question goes to Mrs. Krom-Kolb, because one of the ideas behind was that we can achieve the change without growth. Now, this seems to be obvious, but on the other hand, it also seems to be highly unfair. In this moment, we have nearly 700 or 800 million people who live with less than $2 per day. This is really not a lot. Of course, we can say we change the distribution. How can we do it? I think there are ways. I'm in complete agreement with that. But I think, and this is my question, probably you mean without material growth. You mean probably that, because if you pay a teacher the double, this does not have a huge impact normally on sustainable lifestyle, because the teacher will not use more things, and normally the material impact of that is very low. Second, if you take material growth, we have a lot of development also in the industry where you have the same product but with less weight, with less substances, so there is a lot of innovation in that. So my invitation here is to have a differentiated view on growth and to not overlook the big contribution of innovation if we go for a sustainable lifestyle. This is my question, especially to Ms. Kolb. Thank you.
We have another question, particularly for Professor Krom-Kolb. Perhaps you can put all together. From Mark Charlesworth. It says, given the interfaith intervention hosted by the Vatican before the COP in Glasgow was rather direct and effectively ignored by governments, do you have any suggestion about how to get governments to pay attention to the majority of global population who are not consumerist and hedonistic? Perhaps you can begin, Professor Kropp, with this question, and then some thoughts, very briefly, on the other questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I don't have a very good answer to that. I think there's different ways of trying to get the attention, but essentially, as was said by one of my co-speakers, there are very strong interests that prevent focusing on that part of the world. And I think we have to find ways to really get around that. And I'm not quite sure how you can do that. But I do think that churches should continue to come up with such statements, and especially come up with them together, so one can see that it is not a unilateral aspect, but a joint effort by many different churches. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's an important step. But I don't have a good answer on how to make politicians be receptive of that type of thing. What regards growth, I think we should stop being so obsessed with growth. I don't think the question is, do we need growth or don't we need growth? I think the question is, what do we want to achieve? We want to achieve a good life for all within the planetary boundaries. And I think that is what we need to aim for. And if that can happen together with material growth, well, fine. Personally, I don't think so. But if that's possible, that's fine. If it's not, then we'll have to do with some other means. And I think one of the sort of rails we are always caught in is this question: do we need economic growth or don't we need it? How do we measure it? Even that is not quite clear. So I think we should forget about that question and more concentrate more on where do we get that? What is the vision of the world that we want to achieve? And essentially, on an international level, that was put into the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but not by picking those which are of special interest to us, but by trying to achieve all of them, which will also include SDG 8, which has economic growth in its title. And I think that is fully justified for some parts of the world, but not for the global economy as such. But again, that should not be the focus. Is it growth or is it not growth? But are we getting closer to a good life for all within the planetary boundaries?
Thank you very much. Eccellenza?
Sì, grazie. Vorrei rispondere o condividere con voi qualche pensiero sulla prima domanda delle persone migranti, rifugiati a causa dei cambiamenti ecologici che non lasciano spazio per la vita degna delle persone umane. Mi sembra che la questione è molto attuale e grazie per questa domanda. Penso che anche qui la Chiesa ha un ruolo molto importante da svolgere. Prima di tutto, a risvegliare le coscienze dei responsabili in questo mondo per questo problema, che non è problema astratto, ma problema delle concrete persone umane. Sempre dove è colpita la persona umana nella sua esistenza culturale, spirituale, ma anche quotidiana, la Chiesa ha un dovere divino, materno, di alzare la voce e poi risvegliare le coscienze e, seconda cosa, diventare la voce di questa gente che soffre, perché talvolta non si sentono, non si audisce questa voce, viene dimenticata, ignorata. Il terzo momento, ciò che facciamo sempre, è accogliere queste persone con le braccia aperte, fare ciò che è possibile nelle nostre forze, nelle nostre comunità, affinché loro si sentono a casa, si sentono accolti, sostenuti. E qui c'è un potenziale enorme, materiale, economico, forse manca talvolta questa sensibilità. Ma questi eventi tragici di Ucraina e la risposta spontanea delle società europee mostrano che la prontezza, l'apertura fondamentale nelle nostre società occidentali esiste. E l'ultima cosa, la Chiesa potrebbe anche formulare le proposte e le iniziative per il mondo politico e economico per affrontare questi problemi nuovi.
Grazie, Eccellenza. Marie?
Thank you very much for the question. It's also very interesting for me as president of this international youth movement, because sometimes I have the feeling that in Europe we are still somehow waiting on this climate crisis to actually happen, and in other parts of the world it is for a long time already happening. That's also what we see in our member organizations. People struggle a lot because of the acute climate changes. And I definitely agree with what was said before, that we have a duty and also a task as Christian family to help those people find a new home, find a new place, to use also the creativity and the network structures that we as church and Christian family have to help out wherever we can. But on the other hand, for me it would be very important that church also puts all their activities under the questions of fighting the climate crisis and what we can do to prevent those things from happening and to prevent those loss of homes for people all over the world.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lambert.
Yes, on this question of welcoming people who are forcibly displaced by climate change, well, there will be no way around that. Of course, creating a global right for that will take ages, but the reality of things will make that indeed, well, these people will need to be welcomed. And on that, I would say again, as a European, there's a good track record and a bad track record. What is just happening now with the 3 million Ukrainian refugees is rather a sign of hope, in the sense that there have been no questions asked. These people are welcome, but remember, that was not so long ago, 7 years ago, when the people banging on our doors were coming from Syria, Afghanistan, or Ethiopia or Eritrea, then if you accept Austria, Germany, and Sweden, the doors were closed. And since then, in between, Europe has been quite close to welcoming almost anyone. It has been a fortress Europe, and this will need to change. This will need to change, and that means that we will need to get organized, because indeed, we are a part of humanity that is rather rich and therefore well-equipped to welcome people, but we will need to change a number of things, starting politically. On the growth issue, indeed, I just want to say that indeed, well-being is correlated to material growth to a certain extent. I would say the beginning of the curve. And yes, there's still a significant part of humanity that deserves, that needs increased material comfort to live a fulfilling life. And for that, for those people, economic growth is absolutely needed. But that also means that beyond a certain point, actually more growth does not increase the well-being of people. And there we will need to shrink or ecological footprint, and I'm afraid to say that there is a correlation between economic growth and ecological footprint. So there's no way around that. If we want to reduce the ecological footprint, the size of the economy will need to be reduced in the developed world. There's no way around that. That doesn't mean that we can't have a good life with less ecological footprint, and I would even say I think it's a condition, because when you see the correlation between abundance and the consumption of tranquilizers and the level of mental health of in our countries, you see that something is deeply wrong. But so it's really a differentiated picture depending on which part of humanity you're looking at. But as the professor said, the equation that we need to solve is a good life for everyone within the biophysical limits of the planet. I think it can be done. Many studies show that even with 10 billion people on this planet, this is feasible, but that requires drastic change.
Thank you very much. And since we are running out of time, we have a last question from Zoom. I was pretty sure we could get one of the sharp questions of Gabriela, and she did it. Gabriela Schneider asks about changing hearts and minds for sufficiency. As the time window for measures is closing in the next decade, do we have enough time for that? We don't have enough time for answers, so 1 minute each, if you can wrap up everything 1 minute. Professor Kropp.
Well, it's necessary, so we have to do it. We have to get it done. And I think we can do it by good example and by living it ourselves and by introducing it into our educational system and, of course, through churches. So I think the necessary has to be made possible. And it's easier, not easier, but it can be faster to change minds and hearts than it can be to develop technologies. Thank you.
Sicuramente la grazia può fare i miracoli e dobbiamo affidare a Dio tutti i nostri sfide, le nostre problemi con grande convinzione che ciò che noi non riusciremo a fare, Lui ci sostenerà con la sua grazia, ma dobbiamo fare prima di tutto anche il nostro dovere e questo consiste nel riconoscimento del problema, nel riconoscimento della propria responsabilità, nell'engaggiamento molto diciamo decisivo al cambiamento del proprio cuore, perché da qui parte tutto il cambiamento nel cosmo intero. Per questo è il tempo della Quaresima, tempo opportuno della conversione, quella generale evangelica ma anche quella ecologica.
Marie?
I have to say that for me the most important point would be to always keep up the communication and to always stay in dialogue, to exchange our good ideas, the best practice examples that we already have, and to really advocate for them so that also other people can relate to this and use our ideas and our creativity. And I was very touched by what Professor Kromkolb said before, that in groups we are much stronger than as individuals, and we are already such a large group, and that is something we need to use for the future.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lambert, I know it's difficult to ask a politician to be short, but it's like asking a priest to be short in a homily, so you can make it.
Sure, absolutely. No, I think I will quote Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, when there's a will, there's a way. And indeed, the Ukrainian people are showing that when there is an existent challenge, a whole society can focus on it and try to respond to it. It's not a pleasant challenge, of course, and people are getting killed doing that. But I do believe that when humanity realizes this is a life and death issue, we can focus the minds on the need for change. One key element to mobilize society is that it is us. It is not a sum of me's, of I. And in order to be a we, well, there needs to be justice. As long as I have the impression that I need to make massive efforts and my neighbor just can get away without any effort, I will be tempted not to do anything. But if there is justice in the effort that is required from every one of us, then I do believe that we can mobilize the entire society to face the challenge. Was that short enough?
Very short. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all the speakers of this afternoon, Professor Elga Kromkolb, His Excellency Monsignor Bogdan Jurak, Ms. Marie Laval, and Mr. Philip Lambert for their presentations and their warm participation to this debate. And before leaving, I'm obliged to give you few indications, what in Italian we call avvisi parrocchiali, everything that is needed for the good running of the community life. Now we can go to the coffee break, and the workshops will begin at the usual places, at 5:30 and we'll finish at 6:30. At 7 o'clock, we will meet again at the London meeting room. You will find the indications going to the lobby for the cultural event Romani Kereka. Remember, tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, we will resume our session, the last session, for the concluding remarks. Another thing to be aware of, the hotel checkout should be done tomorrow, for those leaving tomorrow, by noon, and the luggage can be left at the reception. For any doubt or question, you can contact our support staff, which we heartfully thank for their tireless work these days. Thank you very much to all of you.